welcome back. We're going to continue reading we're writing the Constitution by Jean Fritz. All right, so right now in our story, we are working through a big stumbling block on how the power is going to be divided in government. Should states be represented? Should large states be represented more than smaller states? And so we are really working at figuring that out in our story right now. Okay? At one point, the tension was so great that Franklin suggested they ask a minister to start them off every day with a prayer. But they couldn't even agree on this. A delegate from North Carolina pointed out that there wasn't enough money to pay a minister. Hamilton said that the appearance of a minister would start rumors. People would say that if the convention was suddenly in need of prayer, it must be in deep trouble. In particular, the small states wanted to know if they would have an equal vote in the Senate. The delegates would not reach a decision. When they took a vote, it came out to a tie. 5 yes, 5 no, with Georgia's delegates divided. The small states had become so bitter that once they threatened to break off from the rest of the country and make their own treaties with foreign nations. This was the lowest point of the whole summer. The convention was held together now, Luther Martin said, by no more than a strength of a hair. Washington, not easily discouraged, admitted that he almost despaired, and indeed his feelings must have been shown on his face. He had his Valley Forge look, people said. Perhaps the weather helped to break the stalemate. The month-long heat wave broke over the weekend of July 14 and 15th, and by Monday, July 16th, the delegates seemed to recognize how urgent it was to find a way to agree, and they did. They called it the Great Compromise. Every state would have 2 members in the Senate with equal votes, while the House of Representatives would have 1 representative for every 40,000 inhabitants. Later, this was changed to read not to exceed 1 for every 30,000. It was such a relief to have this settled that the convention appointed a committee of 5 to put their resolution in order and to make a document that would read like a constitution. Then, the delegates voted themselves a 10-day vacation from July 26 to August 6. George Washington went fishing and caught a mess of perch near Trenton. It was a welcome diversion. Still, as always, he was homesick for Mount Vernon. He had written home earlier that he wouldn't be back before harvest, and God knows how long it may be after. He wanted the honeysuckle against his house nailed up. "Have you thinned out the carrots?" he asked. 6 weeks of work still lay ahead after the convention reassembled. Throughout the discussions, there had been trouble not only between the large states and the small states, but between northern and southern states. The southern states worried about their trade. Since the House of Representatives was dominated by northern states where more people lived, would it be fair to the South? The House had the power to tax what was sold and sent out of the states and to tax what was brought into the states. So what would happen to tobacco, rice, and indigo grown in the South and sold abroad? What would happen to slaves brought into the South? Would the North try to get rid of slavery altogether? Some Northern delegates were quick to say that was exactly what they wanted, but some Southern delegates were just as quick to say that they wouldn't belong to a government that dictated their private business. It was clear that if they wanted a constitution, the North and South would have to strike a bargain. So the northern states agreed to continue the slave trade until 1808, and the southern states agreed to give their demand that commercial regulations had to be passed by a 2/3 vote of both houses. In addition, no one would have to pay more than $10 tax on a slave brought into the country. And there were other questions. Where would the government be located? New York? Philadelphia? A special district would be set aside, they said, no more than 10 miles square. But since they couldn't decide where it should be, they decided to let the new Congress take care of it. How about letting foreigners be members of Congress? Gouverneur Morris called the tall boy of the convention, pointed out that if it took 7 years to learn how to be a shoemaker, a foreigner ought to spend 14 years to learn how to be an American legislator. In the end, a senator was required to be a citizen for 9 years, a representative 7 years, and the chief executive or president had to be a native born. They made provisions for new states to join the Union and specified how additions or changes to the Constitution could be made in the future. These would be called amendments, but under no circumstances were they to change the type of government the delegates had created. The delegates didn't want any American dukes or lords suddenly popping up in their society. No title of nobility, they said, shall be granted by the United States. Now the end was actually in sight, but how should they represent the Constitution to the states? Should each state legislature vote on whether it would accept or ratify the Constitution? No, they decided. The state legislators could not be trusted. They would want to keep their own power in their state and would vote no. It would be better if each state called its own special convention. Next came the question, how many states had to ratify the Constitution before it became a law of the land? Some delegates wanted all 13 states to ratify, but everyone knew Rhode Island wouldn't do it, and New York was doubtful, so it was agreed that if 9 states ratified, they'd have a nation. Any that didn't ratify would simply not be in the Union. On September 8th, the Constitution was sent to a committee to write it up in a final form. 4 days later, a revised and very elegant-sounding Constitution was presented to the delegates. "We the people," it began. It was impressive, but it was also scary. Some of the delegates didn't think of themselves as "we the people." It gave them a strange feeling to have created a nation that they didn't really know. All at once, some had last-minute thoughts. They had not included a Bill of Rights, which spelled out the rights of individual persons, it was pointed out. There was no mention of freedom of religion, freedom of speech, trial by jury, all those rights which they cherished, in which many states had listed in their state constitutions. Madison sighed. There was no need for a Bill of Rights, he said. It was taken for granted that individuals kept all the rights they didn't specifically give over to the government. Finally, with some changes, the Constitution was set out to be engrossed on parchment, an official document for the delegates to sign, parchment meaning parchment paper. When it came back, the delegates looked at it in wonder. After all, this was the first time that the people had written down rules to start a nation off from scratch. On paper, the Constitution looked so real that Washington declared it was a little short of a miracle. Still, it was not perfect, Benjamin Franklin pointed out. He disagreed with some parts, but then he wasn't perfect either. None of them were, and he was convinced that this was the best they could do. He hoped the delegates would give their new Constitution a chance. Let them not undo their summer's work, he begged, by carrying out their old arguments into the public. Let them stand together. Some members, like Luther Martin, who would not have signed, had already gone home. But there were 42 delegates present on September 17th, and 39 signed. At the last minute, 3 backed out. Elbridge Gerry was one of them. Without a Bill of Rights, he said, he couldn't put his name down. Edmund Randolph, whose Virginia plan had actually formed the basis of the Constitution, got cold feet. Perhaps he'd been too hasty. Perhaps he was still too much of a Virginian to be an American, too. Perhaps he should wait to see how the country reacted before he made up his mind. George Mason was also of Virginia, refused to sign. Now it was up to the country. After so much secrecy, people didn't know what to expect. But once they had read the Constitution, they were quick to take sides. Those who were for it called themselves Federalists. Those who were against called Anti-Federalists, although the antis said they were the true Federalists, and those in favor of the Constitution should be called Nationalists. It took more than 6 months for the states, one by one, to call their conventions, debate, and vote. Meanwhile, Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and other strong Federalist John Jay began writing newspaper articles explaining just how the Constitution would work. They showed how different branches of government would serve as a check on each other so that no branch and no person could become too powerful. Steeped in history, these men understood human nature and the temptations of power. They might not expect to make a government absolutely safe from all forms of tyranny, but their object was to create a kind of obstacle game which would keep the government in balance. Indeed, they talked so much of checks and balances that this might describe the kind of game it was. Every bill in the House of Representatives passed, for instance, had to go to Senate for approval. If it made it through the Senate, then it had to go to the President for his signature. If he did not like the bill, he could veto or refuse to sign it. But the House and Senate still had another chance. If 2/3 of their members voted for it, then it would pass anyway. A final big check lay in the Supreme Court, which could, in the course of legal proceedings, decide if a law, even a state law, was constitutional or not. There was a whole network of such checks. Although the president could appoint an ambassador to the other countries, judges to the Supreme Court, and a variety of other officers, the Senate had to approve his choices. Any amendment proposed to the Constitution had to be submitted to the states for their approval. Now, how, the Federalists asked, could tyranny slip through such a well-ordered system? Besides, the people themselves had the controlling power. Every 4 years, they would be electing their president. As stated, intervals, they would also be electing the representatives in Congress. The argument of the Federalists were so strong and so well written that many people gradually grew to the idea of becoming a nation. I'm going to stop our story there. So right now we have a written down constitution, and it's going out to our 13 colonies or states to be approved or ratified. They are struggling. It's a big deal to finally become a nation, and a lot of people are scared that they're going to have a situation where a king is going to be in charge again, or one person is going to be in charge again, and they did not want that to happen. So that's why a lot of them were scared to sign it at first. However, there are a lot of good reasons, these checks and balances, as they're called, to how these 3 different branches of government would work together to make sure that that didn't happen again. We will continue on next time with discussing who wasn't for it, why they weren't for it, and the ways that it ended up finally becoming our own constitution.